AF5003, do you read? AF5003, do you read? AF5003, do you read?
By the middle of the 20th century, the United States and the Soviet Union had locked themselves into a dangerous race for military superiority.
If this is just an empty container, why the continued secrecy? We may never know if there was a core inside this birdcage, because the Air Force and US government have refused comment and shut the door on this case.
And at the heart of that race sat one aircraft, a machine built to carry humanity's most powerful weapon across entire continents. The Convair B-36 Peacemaker. It was a bomber so massive it almost didn't look like it should be able to fly. 6 enormous piston engines, 4 extra jet engines bolted on for good measure. This was a plane built to cross thousands of miles without ever needing to stop. Its purpose was blunt and simple: carry nuclear weapons deep into enemy territory. But on one winter night in 1950, one of these giants vanished over the Pacific Ocean. Inside, it was a nuclear weapon. The crew would abandon the aircraft mid-flight. The bomber itself would go down alone, crashing into the mountains of British Columbia. And for years afterward, the United States government would be left wrestling with a single, unresolved question: what happened to the atomic bomb that fell from the sky? The aircraft at the center of this story was no ordinary bomber. It was the B-36B Peacemaker, and at the dawn of the 1950s, it represented nothing less than the future of American air power. Everything about it was oversized. Its wings stretched more than 230 feet from tip to tip. It could climb higher than most fighters of its era, and with a range of over 10,000 miles, it could reach targets no previous bomber had ever been able to touch. The thinking behind it was straightforward. If a nuclear war ever broke out, American bombers would need to survive long enough to reach deep into Soviet territory, which meant flying farther, climbing higher, and holding heavier weapons than anything that had come before. The B-36 became one of the defining symbols of America's nuclear deterrence strategy. But that kind of responsibility came with a shadow attached to it. Every training flight, every test mission, every emergency carried within it the possibility of disaster, because these aircraft weren't hauling ordinary cargo. They were carrying weapons capable of wiping entire cities off the map. On February 13, 1950, a B-36 bomber from the 436th Bomb Squadron took off on what was supposed to be a routine training exercise, a long-range simulation of a nuclear strike, flying from Alaska toward the west coast of the United States before turning back. Nothing about it was meant to be remarkable, but hidden inside the aircraft was something that would soon turn this flight into one of the strangest military incidents in American history: a nuclear weapon. 17 men made up the crew of the B-36 that night. At the front sat the man responsible for all of them, Captain Harold L. Barry, a seasoned Air Force pilot now in command of one of the most complicated machines ever built. Behind him were the specialists who kept that machine alive: co-pilots, navigators, engineers, radio operators, weapons specialists, each one holding a piece of the aircraft's survival in their hands. Because flying the B-36 was nothing like flying an ordinary plane, this was closer to commanding a flying fortress, a command center in the sky, where thousands of mechanical systems all had to work together at once. The engines, the navigation equipment, the pressurization system, the weapon system, every single one of them had to function perfectly. There was no room for error, not with what this aircraft was carrying. When it finally lifted off into the frozen skies over Alaska, Everything seemed fine. The bomber climbed steadily away from the runway, its engines running exactly as they should. The crew settled into their planned route, and for a while, there was nothing to suggest that this flight, this ordinary training mission, was about to become one of the most infamous nuclear accidents of the entire Cold War. For hours, the aircraft pushed on through the darkness, but then something changed. For most of the flight, the B-36 had behaved exactly as it should, but as it crossed into the northern reaches of the Pacific, the crew ran into the one problem every pilot dreads: mechanical failure. The B-36 relied on 6 massive piston engines mounted along its wings. And on this mission, several of them began to fail, one after another, bleeding power from an aircraft that couldn't afford to lose it. The B-36 was designed to keep flying even with a few engines down. But there was a limit to that, and this bomber was pushing right up against it, carrying a nuclear weapon, cutting through freezing air, thousands of feet above open ocean, and growing harder to control with every passing minute. One engine started sputtering, then another followed. The crew scrambled through their emergency checklists, knowing that every decision now carried real weight. One wrong call could send the entire aircraft into the sea, and mechanical failure wasn't the only enemy that night. The bomber was flying over one of the most unforgiving stretches of the planet, the northern Pacific, a vast expanse of ocean, mountains, and bitter cold. Below them lay British Columbia, a wilderness of dense forest and jagged peaks. If the aircraft couldn't stay airborne, there were almost nowhere safe left to put it down. What made this flight different, what would later turn it into a closely guarded government secret, was what the bomber was carrying: a nuclear weapon, specifically a Mark IV atomic bomb, built on the same technology behind America's earliest nuclear weapons. But there was one crucial detail that set this particular bomb apart. It didn't contain the plutonium core needed to actually trigger a nuclear explosion. Instead, it held a conventional explosive charge along with nuclear material used purely for testing. That didn't make it safe though. Even without full nuclear capability, it was still an extraordinarily dangerous device. And now, with the aircraft failing around them, the crew faced a choice: keep the bomb on board and try to save the plane, or get rid of the danger before abandoning ship. As conditions kept deteriorating, Captain Martin came to a grim realization: the bomber might not make it. His crew were staring down an impossible decision: risk everything trying to save the aircraft, or think first about the people on the ground below, since the B-36 was now drifting toward populated areas, and a crash with the weapon still on board would only make things worse. So the call was made. The bomb had to go. It was released over the open water of the Pacific. When it struck the surface, its conventional explosives detonated, then a large explosion. But there was no nuclear blast. The weapon had been destroyed exactly as intended. The bomb was gone. The aircraft, however, was still in serious trouble. Even with the weapon gone, the crew's problems were far from over. The B-36 itself couldn't keep flying. It was still losing power. The weather was turning worse by the minute, and there simply weren't many options left. Captain Martin made the call that no pilot ever wants to make. The bomber would have to be abandoned. One by one, the crew prepared to jump. For many of them, this would be the last time they'd ever lay eyes on the aircraft that had carried them so far. A machine that, in a matter of moments, would become nothing more than a falling shape, disappearing into the wilderness below. They jumped over British Columbia, scattering across some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Most of them survived the landing, but now they were alone. Cold, in the dark, in country none of them knew, while somewhere above them, their aircraft kept flying without a single person left on board. And that's when something strange happened. The B-36 didn't simply fall from the sky, it kept going. An enormous, unmanned nuclear bomber, cutting silently through the night with no one at the controls, until finally it reached the mountains of British Columbia and came down for the last time. The abandoned bomber eventually went down somewhere deep in the mountains of British Columbia, a place about as remote and hostile as it gets. Dense forest, steep terrain, brutal cold. For the investigators who would eventually be sent in to find it, just locating the wreckage would prove to be a serious challenge on its own. Search crews set out knowing only that the bomber had gone down somewhere in that vast stretch of wilderness, but somewhere covered an enormous amount of ground. And the question hanging over the entire search wasn't just where the plane had crashed. It was something far more urgent. What had happened to the nuclear weapon it had been carrying? The moment the B-36 vanished, the US Air Force launched a massive search operation. But this was no ordinary recovery mission. The missing aircraft was carrying something far more significant than itself: a nuclear weapon. The search teams needed real answers. Where exactly had the bomber gone down? Had the weapon survived the crash? And was there any lingering danger hidden somewhere in the wilds of British Columbia? All they had to go on was the aircraft's last known position, somewhere along the rugged coastline of British Columbia. And that alone made the search brutally difficult. Thousands of square miles of mountain and forest stood between them and the wreckage, and the weather could shift in an instant, with snow and poor visibility turning any aerial search into a genuine gamble. Days went by. Aircraft scanned the skies, ships combed the coast, ground teams pushed into the most remote areas they could reach. And then, finally, they found something. The wreckage of the B-36 turned up, scattered across the mountains. The same massive aircraft that had once symbolized the strength of America's nuclear program, now broken apart and buried in the wilderness. The impact had been violent enough to tear the plane into pieces. Engines, wings, and fuselage sections scattered throughout the crash site. Investigators moved in to comb through every fragment, trying to piece together exactly what had happened in the aircraft's final moments. What they found suggested the bomber had stayed largely intact right up until it hit the ground. There was no evidence it had broken apart in the air. It had simply kept flying, alone, until it struck the mountains. Among the wreckage, they recovered sections of the fuselage, engine parts, pieces of the wings, flight equipment, and various military systems that had once operated inside the bomber. Each piece told investigators a little more about those final moments. But one thing was conspicuously missing: the most important piece of all, the nuclear weapon itself. Search teams combed the crash site, but the atomic bomb was nowhere to be found, and that was a serious problem. A nuclear weapon belonging to the United States military had simply disappeared somewhere between the depth of the Pacific and the mountains of British Columbia. Officially, the story was straightforward. The weapon had been deliberately released before the crew bailed out, and it had gone down into the Pacific, where the flash and explosion witnesses reported had come from its conventional explosives detonating on impact. But exactly where it had ended up remained an open question. For years afterward, people couldn't help but wonder, had the weapon actually been recovered? Was it still sitting somewhere beneath the Pacific? Could it still pose any kind of threat? The US government insisted there was no nuclear danger, but the incident would go down as one of the earliest examples of what the military came to call a broken arrow, the term used for any accident involving a nuclear weapon. While the fate of the aircraft remained uncertain, the story of its crew took a very different turn. The 17 men who had jumped from the B-36 now found themselves fighting simply to survive, scattered across one of the harshest environments in North America. Several were injured, supplies were limited, and rescue was anything but guaranteed. Eventually, though, every one of them was found and brought to safety. A genuinely remarkable outcome, given how easily this could have ended in 17 deaths instead. What might have been a tragedy became, instead, a story about training, discipline, and sheer human endurance. Still, the incident left the military with some uncomfortable questions to answer. Just how safe were nuclear weapons during routine training flights? Should atomic bombs even be flown on missions like this one? And how much of any of it should the public actually be told? The crash in British Columbia wasn't an isolated event. It was an early sign of a much bigger, more uncomfortable reality. As the United States expanded its fleet of nuclear-armed bombers, more and more aircraft were flying with atomic weapons on board around the world. And that created a paradox the military would have to live with. The very planes built to prevent a nuclear war were also, through accidents like this one, capable of creating nuclear emergencies of their own. The British Columbia crash turned out to be just the beginning of a growing list of such incidents. Similar accidents would later occur in Spain, in Greenland, and elsewhere in the United States. each one raising the same unavoidable question: how much risk was acceptable in the name of nuclear security? Once the wreckage had been located, the US Air Force launched a full investigation into how the B-36 had been lost. Investigators had one clear goal: to understand exactly what had unfolded during those final hours, why the aircraft had failed, why the crew had been forced to abandon it, and above all, what had ultimately become of the nuclear weapon. Piecing together the bomber's last flight, the investigation confirmed the basic outline of events. The aircraft had taken off on a training mission, flying a simulated nuclear strike route, not an actual attack, but a rehearsal of the procedures that would be needed in a real conflict. Partway through, mechanical failures had derailed everything. For all its power, the B-36 was an extraordinarily complex machine, dependent on 6 piston engines, working in near-perfect coordination. Once several of them failed, the aircraft's ability to stay airborne collapsed rapidly. In the end, investigators concluded that Captain Martin had made the right call. Continuing to fly a crippled aircraft with a nuclear weapon on board would have only made a bad situation far more dangerous. Even after the wreckage was found, one mystery still lingered. Where exactly was the weapon? According to the official account, the bomb had been deliberately dropped into the ocean before the crew bailed out, its conventional explosives detonating on impact. The military maintained that the nuclear material required for an actual explosion had never been installed, meaning a nuclear detonation had never truly been possible. But that reassurance didn't erase the deeper problem. The United States had, in a very real sense, lost control of a nuclear weapon. Even without the risk of a nuclear blast, the idea that atomic material could simply go missing in an accident was unsettling in its own right. At the time, the public heard very little about any of it. Nuclear information during the early Cold War was tightly guarded, and military officials were careful about what they revealed. The message to the public was simple and reassuring. There was no danger, but behind that calm statement sat a far messier truth. The nuclear age had introduced an entirely new kind of accident, one where a weapon could be lost without a war ever having started. The B-36 crash became one of the first cases to earn the label broken arrow, a military term for any accident involving a nuclear weapon. It didn't mean an attack. It didn't mean the weapon had been used on purpose. It simply meant something had gone wrong. A crash, a loss, an accident. In the decades that followed, more broken arrow incidents would occur. Aircraft carrying nuclear weapons would go down, weapons would be damaged, and each time, governments would be forced to confront the same uncomfortable question: how do you keep thousands of nuclear weapons secure while they are constantly being moved around the world? Today, the B-36 Peacemaker is remembered as one of the defining aircraft of the early Cold War, a symbol of American technological power and a new era in which bombers could carry weapons capable of reshaping history. But the crash in British Columbia revealed the other side of that power. Technology could open up incredible possibilities. It could just as easily open the door to incredible risk. Somewhere in the mountains of British Columbia, the wreckage of that bomber still remains. Fragments of a machine that once represented the future, now slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. The aircraft never came home. The crew survived. The weapon was never publicly recovered. And decades later, the questions haven't gone away. Was the weapon really where the military said it was? Was the full story ever actually told? Could there still be details buried somewhere in classified files, waiting to be uncovered? Historians and aviation researchers are still drawn to these questions because this was never just a plane crash. It was a moment when the most powerful weapon humanity had ever built ended up at the center of an ordinary training mission that went terribly wrong. The B-36 accident stands as a warning, a reminder that nuclear danger doesn't only come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from mistakes, from machines that fail, from impossible decisions made by ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. On February 13, 1950, a B-36 bomber vanished into the wilderness of British Columbia. It was carrying a nuclear weapon, it lost power, its crew was forced to abandon it, and the aircraft went down alone, crashing into the mountains with no one left aboard. But that wasn't where the story ended, because this accident became one of the earliest warnings of the nuclear age. Proof that even in peacetime, the world was quietly carrying weapons powerful enough to change the course of civilization. The B-36 had been built to prevent war. In the end, though, it became part of a very different kind of story. One about accidents, about secrets, and about the immense, frightening responsibility of controlling humanity's most destructive technology. The 1950 B-36 crash remains one of the earliest nuclear aviation accidents of the Cold War.